Sudan is a country which was initially intended to act as a refuge and a sanctuary for the people who bravely fled from turmoil and persecution in faraway lands. It soon became its antithesis. In this first episode of Timelines, we will go through a tale of hope and doubt, prosperity and turmoil, and how colonialism, wars, and tribal mixing caused a deeply divided country. This is a timeline of Sudan, the timeline you never knew.
The world has gained a new nation. The Sudan, for 58 years under the joint rule of Britain and Egypt, becomes an independent republic. The Proclamation of Independence is read from the balcony of the House of Representatives in Khartoum, and the new flag is hoisted. Blue for the Nile, yellow for the desert, green for agriculture. A five-man Supreme Commission will act for the time being as head of state. A joint session of the Senate and the House of Representatives hears the new republic proclaimed. Premier El Azari thanks Britain and Egypt for giving his country freedom to work out its own destiny.
The fifth millennium refers to the time period spanning from 5000 to 4001 BC. This was a period of innovation which saw the spread of agriculture from Western Asia throughout southern and central Europe. It was one of the first instances of urban culture flourishing and producing key moments of innovation such as the wheel. The millennium saw the wide-scale transition of many human cultures from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to one of agriculture and settlement, leading to population expansion happening. This is the reason this time period is often called the agricultural revolution or the Neolithic revolution, leading to people from this time period being classed as the Neolithic people. This was the first notable period in Sudan's history. It was these Neolithic people who migrated in the 5th millennium from the drying Sahara Desert to other areas further along Africa. This migration was most likely due to the drying Sahara Desert being bad for crops and farming, which meant that a culture of farming could not possibly survive there, never mind thrive there. This journey led to many of the Neolithic people being spread out all around the world, leading to different cultures and adaptations being produced naturally over time. However, what is dictated by historical fact is that a portion of these migrants settled into the area in Africa we now know as Sudan. This settling meant that by the 8th millennium, the Neolithic people had settled into a sedentary way of life in fortified mud brick villages. The inhabitants of these mud brick villages were noted to have survived from fishing, hunting, and grain gathering and cattle herding. From what can be historically gathered, it seemed that most of the time they were subsistence farmers and there was no real sign of a centralized government. However, the lack of social order and governing bodies would soon change with the birth of the Kingdom of Kush in 1700 BC. The Kingdom of Kush was produced by cultural and genetic mixing that developed a social hierarchy. By the year 3300 BC, the idea of governing bodies and rulers had developed and evolved into a system of pharaonic kingship in Sudan. This period, as noted, started with the migration and ended with the governing bodies, and so this time period was often historically listed as prehistoric Sudan. Prehistoric Sudan refers to Sudan before 800 BC, and it is the second notable period in Sudan's history. The Kingdom of Kush lasted between 800 BC to 350 AD, geographically positioned between the ancient Nubian state centered on the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and the Athabur River and the Nile River. The Kingdom of Kush was established at the end of the Bronze Era, which was a time of social development, which led to the Kingdom of Kush, and so the Kushites conquering from South Kordofan, one of the 18 provinces of Sudan, to Sinai, a desert between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. The Kushites at once became so powerful that the Kushite leader Esarhaddon drove the Nubians out of Egypt entirely. This military might and showing of said might was also continued by Esarhaddon's successor, Ashurbanipal. and he lasted and ruled from
reign 660 to 627.
whom sent a larger army
Hey my army, let's go and invade from Igtidan to Mina
into southern Egypt and routed us through Tantamani, ending all hopes of a revival of the Nubian empires. This military domination against the Nubians helped make the Kingdom of Kush a great power in Africa at the time. Some would arguably say that their mentality and demeanor continue on with their modern descendants. The power the Kushites had in this period caused them to be the name of the period, helping to further emphasize the power they had. This was the third notable period in Sudan's history. We then speed up to the fourth notable period in Sudan's history, where in 1504 the Fund was recorded to have set up the Kingdom of Sudan and Islam began to be preached by holy men who settled in the 15th and 16th centuries. The sects of Islam these holy men preached was Sunni Islam with some Sufi elements.
Hello brother, have you heard of Islam? It's great. I practice Sunni Islam with some Sufi elements. You should read upon it. Thanks, I will, good sir. My pleasure.
The fund was set up by the Fund Sultanate with Abdullah Jama and ruled for several centuries. They most prominently overthrew the remnants of the old Christian kingdom of Al-Udiya, and in 1504 a Fund leader named Amara Dankas founded the Black Sultanate at Sennar. This Black Sultanate soon became a key part of the Fund Empire. The true origins of the Fund is unknown, but one source claims that they were descendants of Banu Umayyah, a ruling family in the Islamic Caliphate between 661 and 750 AD, and Islamic Spain in 1031 AD. However, before Islam, they were a prominent clan in the Khurafa, signaling their power through the Islamic world. One of the more credible resources I found claims that the descendants of Banu Umayyah escaped the slaughter of the Abbasids by fleeing into Abyssinia when moving inwards into the Nubian territory. This makes good sense to some historians because at the time Nubian territory was known across Arabia since ancient times to protect guests and refugees. However, this source theory has been contested by Scottish traveller and travel writer James Bruce, who theorized in his books Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile that the Fund descended from the Shilluk people. The Shilluk people were closely related members of the Neolithic groups. The third and final hypothesis is that they were descendants of the remnants of the kingdom of Al-Udiya, Nubians who escaped further south to replenish their supplies and resources and then returned to establish their state. However, the most cited source, and by token the most reputable, is that they were Nubians who mixed with Arabs. Moving further along the timeline, the king Amra Dankas converted from pagan to nominal Christianity to being a Muslim. The Fund, however, still hang on to un-Islamic customs such as drinking alcohol and the divine right of kings until the 16th century. And moreover, the Sudanese adopted some sort of folk Islam, which preserved many of the rituals derived from Christian traditions. At the time, Fund had a conflict with the Ottomans, who had occupied Sulcan around 1526. The Ottomans failed to capture Dongola. The aftermath of the Ottomans' failure of an invasion meant that a minor king in northern Nubia called Ajib came and then was killed by the Fund in 1611 or 1612. The exact time is disputed. King Amara Dankas' successor Abdullah was granted to govern everything north of the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile with considerable autonomy. By the 17th century, the Fund began to decline, and a coup in 1718 brought a dynastic change. These coups will continue all throughout Sudan's existence, plaguing them. However, the coup also helped to kick off a policy of pursuing more orthodox Islam, which in turn caused the Arabization of the state. Another coup that happened between 1761 to 1762 resulted in the Hamaj dynasty regency, and then the sultanates began to fragment, and by the early 19th century the sultanate was restricted to just Adriza. 19th century was the time that Arabic became the most dominant language, This was also perhaps due to the urbanization that was so prominent in the 17th century. As a consequence, this large period of time is categorized by historians as the period of Islamic kingdoms of Sonara and Darfur. The fifth notable period in Sudan's history is perhaps the most Turkish, and so is categorized as the Turkiya Mahdiya Sudan period. It ran from 1821 to 1899. In 1821, the Ottoman ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, had conquered and invaded northern Sudan. He was a wali, a protector, but acted like a khadif being a serviceman in a virtually independent Egypt. He conquered northern Sudan, something that the Turks failed at in the last notable period. He did this by sending his third son Ismail to conquer the country and incorporate it into Egypt. This new incorporation led to the Egyptian authorities improving the infrastructure in northern Sudan. They especially improved irrigation practices and cotton farming production. However, in 1879, the great powers forced the removal of Ismail and established his son Tawfiq Pasha in his place. It was Tawfiq's mismanagement in northern Sudan that caused the Urabi revolt, which threatened the Khedive's survival and the power the Turks had. So added harsher taxes on things such as farmland and irrigation wells. It was Tawfiq's mismanagement in northern Sudan that caused the Urabi revolt, which threatened the Khedive's survival and the power the Egyptians had. It was also harsher taxes on things such as farmland and irrigation wells, as well as most other activities. It was these actions which caused the descent against the Khedival period to spread. Moreover, the highlighted harsh taxes on the farmland and irrigation wells left most farmers in the region with no other choice but to leave their livestock, as they could no longer afford the occupation, therefore hurting the food security and the economy of the region in the process. The 18th century was a time of both economical and cultural change, not only in Sudan but Africa and the whole entire world. It was a brief moment where empires and modern technological innovation occupied the same space. It was a time for some that established great prosperity and riches, and for other problems and despair. It was this period, along with the complex socio-economical and political changes, paired with the underlying racism, which brought the Industrial Revolution and the slave trade to mainstream fruition. Moreover, the slave trade was a large part of the African and Arabic economy, and so in 1870, when the European initiatives were against the slave trade, it had a negative impact on the economy of northern Sudan. And this was because the slave trade had been ingrained into Sudan since the Arabs signed the 600-year Treaty of Baghdad with the Christian Nubian kingdoms of Makura, which meant that they had to trade 360 slaves annually to their northern neighbors in exchange for spices and grains. Thus, it was hard for them to part with the practice that was very much part of their fundamentals. Moreover, the slave trade kept Khartoum a bustling town. Thus, it would be natural that such a change would affect the economy of northern Sudan, and more importantly, their way of life. These changes caused widespread instability, as a stuttering economy often means an apathetic and angry population, the sole fear of every ruler, especially every Sudanese ruler. This anger led to the rise of Mahdist forces. The rise of Mahdist forces was due to a man named Muhammad Ahmed ibn Abdullah, who was also known as the Mahdi, which translates to the Guided One. He offered his followers, known as the Ansars, and the people that surrendered to him a choice between adopting Islam or being killed. The Mahdiya, the name for the Mahdi's regime, continued to gain power, and in gaining this power they imposed traditional Sharia law onto their people. Until the fall of Khartoum in January of 1885, the Mahdi led a successful military campaign against the Turco-Egyptian government of Sudan, which was known as the Turkiya. However, just 6 months after his military success, the Mahdi died. As a consequence of the death of their leader, regional tensions rose during the Mahdist period due to the Khalifa's brutal methods in extending his rule throughout the country. In 1887, a 60,000-man army invaded Ethiopia under the Khalifa's orders. Then in 1889, Abd al-Rahman, the Khalifa's general, tried to invade Egypt. However, the British-led Egyptian army beat them, helping to break the Ansar's image of invincibility, not only causing a loss in the war, but also the Ansar's public perception, which helped get rid of any unwanted wars, fights, or potential invasions or annexings. This failure stayed with the Ansars when the Belgians prevented Mahdi's men from conquering Equatoria. Sadly for the Ansars, failure was yet again with them in 1893 when the Italians this time prevented an Ansar attack in Eritrea, forcing the Ansars to withdraw from Ethiopia. However, the most brutal loss of the Ansars was in 1890, when the British successfully re-established control over Sudan using the name of the Egyptian Khedive. And what was weird about this is that they treated Sudan as a colony. Then in 1899, Britain and Egypt reached an agreement where Sudan was run by a governor-general appointed by Egypt with British consent. However, in reality, Sudan was run as a crown colony, and so the British had most of the power. Moreover, the British's want for dominance in the world politics at the time meant that they sought to stop the uniting of Africa under Egyptian control. This was because a united Africa meant it became harder to control Africa. This was because Africa has a vast amount of wealth of natural resources, something the British lacked. Thus, a loss of control would destroy the immaculate house of cards the British produced. Moving away from Britain under the demolition period, Sudan's border with Abyssinia was contested by raiding tribesmen trading slaves and so breaching the boundaries of the law. Therefore, in 1905, a local chieftain, Sultan Yabu, was reluctant to give up the struggle with the British forces that occupied the Kordofan region. However, he finally did, and so ended the lawlessness in the Kordofan region at the time. However, the continued British occupation of Sudan caused nationalist backlash, to the point that Egyptian nationalists wanted Britain to recognize a union between Egypt and Sudan was independent from British and British rule. A formal end to the Ottoman rule was happening in 1914 due to the Ottoman Empire falling due to their loss in the First World War, and so in December of that year, Sir Reginald Wingate was sent to occupy Sudan as the new military governor. After some time, Hussein Kamal was declared as the Sultan of Egypt and Sudan, along with his brother and successor Fahd I. These two new sultans continued the insistence of a single Egypt-Sudanese state, even when the Sultanate of Egypt was retitled as the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan. However, it was Said Zaghloul who continued to be frustrated in their ambitions until his death in 1927. In 1924, the British decided to govern Sudan as two separate territories, North and South, until independence. This historical separation was perhaps why South Sudan and Northern Sudan could not agree or be ruled together after independence. However, this theory is said to have no merit. Furthermore, the later assassination of the Governor-General of Khartoum in Cairo caused the new Wadaf government to have new demands. When the two battalions in Khartoum were renamed the Sudan Defense Force, which acted under the government and replaced the former garrison of the Egyptian army soldiers due to the Walla Walla incident.
No power on earth now seems able to hold up Italy's sweeping advance across Abyssinia's rain-swept mountains. Now Yahye has been captured, and from there a direct road leads to Addis Ababa. So perhaps it's only a question of time as to when the victorious Italian troops will march into the capital, and the emperor will have to sue for peace. And as the army moves forward, it finds at each Abyssinian encampment ample evidence of the hurried departure of the natives, before the onslaught of modern artillery, high explosive bombs, and it's said even mustard gas. Everywhere camps left in disorder, tents still standing, cooking utensils still lying by the side of dying embers. And in some cases, the natives have even left dumps of ammunition, personal papers and stacks of rifles. So while the world watches, anxious but powerless to stop the bloodshed, the sword of war is still unsheathed.
But trouble was soon to arise as the Wafdist parliamentary majority had rejected Sarawat Pasha's accommodation plan with Austen Chamberlain in London, yet Cairo needed the money. Even though Sudan's revenue peaked at 6.6 million in 1928, the Wafdist disruption and Italian border excursions from Somaliland caused Britain to reduce spending in Sudan. Furthermore, the Great Depression in the 1920s meant that any more spending would have hurt Britain and the British people, something no government wants to deal with. We moved on to July 1936. where the liberal constitutional leader Muhammad Mahmud brought Wafd delegates to London to sign an Anglo-Egyptian treaty.
Nahas Pasha, accompanied by his young wife, arrives at Dover with the Egyptian delegation en route for London. Here in the Lakhana room at the Foreign Office, Mr. Eden, the Foreign Secretary, first appreciates the great occasion.
It has afforded me the keenest pleasure to be able, on behalf of His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, to welcome this Egyptian delegation to London, and by the signature of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of Alliance, to participate in the successful conclusion of the efforts of the last 16 years to reach a satisfactory solution of the problems inherent in Anglo-Egyptian relations. We earnestly hope that the alliance which we thereby inaugurate today may be at once the means of enabling the governments of our two countries to work together in close amity for the furtherance of their common interests, and the symbol of a freely agreed and enduring partnership between the British and Egyptian people.
Britain and Egypt shake hands, and then the treaty is signed, first by Nahas Pasha and his compatriots. Then by Mr. Eden, whose signature is followed by those of Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, Sir John Simon, Lord Halifax, and Sir Miles Lampson. And so, after years of effort, agreement is reached.
Meanwhile, Mussolini wanted to conquer Egypt and Sudan so that he would have a strong hold to invade Abyssinia. This causes the British to prepare for a military defense in the region, whilst the British ambassador is blocked the Italian attempts to secure a non-aggression treaty with Egypt and Sudan. Then a slew of events happen in succession, starting in 1925, where the Sudan Defense Forces played an active part in ending World War II on the part of the Allies due to their colony-esque connection to Britain. And then in 1940, the Italians strategically occupied Kassala and other border areas from Italian Somaliland under the rule of Benito Mussolini. Then in 1942, the Sudan Defense Force also played a part in the invasion of an Italian colony by the British and Commonwealth forces.
Now the troops are getting ready to step out before the area commander and a party of officials at Keren, Eritrea. Watching with particular interest are the chieftains of Sudanese tribes. The famous Sudan Defense Band takes up its position at the head of the troops. In the shadow of the great Sanchal Peak, British and Sudanese soldiers march past. The occasion is to celebrate the entry 2 years before of a victorious army into Asmara, the Eritrean capital. What was once part of the Italian Empire is now the scene of a triumphal march by its conquerors. The fine physique and martial bearing of Sudanese soldiers is traditional. They fight as well as they march. The parade includes all arms. Mule companies, troop carriers, and artillery make an imposing spectacle. The Sudanese are justly proud of their gunnery and equipment. The Sudanese Camel Corps, most famed among desert forces, bring up the rear. Well-trained men and beasts move with grand military precision as they parade in line past the saluting base. Yes, they're guarding one of Britain's outposts now.
A decade passes and the Egyptian Revolution happens, and this signals Sudanese independence.
In 1952, a group of young Egyptian army officers was planning nothing less than revolution. The year's main event would abolish the monarchy and send the king into exile. Soon, the ancient land of Egypt would be declared a republic. In the years leading up to the coup, Arab nationalism was rising in Egypt. King Farouk was seen as being pro-British and supportive of the United Kingdom's control over the Suez Canal. The Egyptian army believed that they had not been properly equipped to support Palestinians during the Israeli War of Independence. When that war was lost in 1948, officers blamed the king for abandoning the army. His Majesty Farouk I had been king of Egypt and Sudan since the age of 16. The 10th ruler from the Muhammad Ali dynasty led a lavish lifestyle that included regular shopping sprees to Europe. This lifestyle had aroused resentment among the people, particularly during the hardships of the Second World War. During his reign, Farouk came to be widely criticized for his corrupt and ineffectual governance. One of the men who had served in the Israeli War of Independence was Colonel Gamal Abdul Nasser. Nasser had commanded a unit in Palestine and was dismayed by the inefficiency and lack of preparation of the Egyptian army. Determined to change his country, he organized a clandestine group inside the army called the Free Officers. The Free Officers were committed to freeing Egypt from British control and establishing a more equitable government. They enlisted General Mohammed Naguib as a public figurehead and prepared to overthrow the monarchy. On January the 25th, 1952, British troops launched an attack on Egyptian police in Ismailia. 50 police officers were killed and many more were wounded. As a result, Egypt erupted in fury. Rioters burnt down British businesses in Cairo and national sentiment reached new heights. The Free Officers planned a coup d'etat for August the 5th. When they learned that the king might be preparing to move against them, they decided to seize power. On the 23rd of July, the people of Cairo awoke to discover the armed forces taking up positions in the streets. At 7:30 a.m., a radio station aired the first communique of the revolution in the name of General Mohammed Naguib. The voice reading the message was Free Officer and future President of Egypt, Anwar Sadat. Sadat justified the revolution by announcing that Egypt had passed through a critical period in recent history that was characterized by bribery, mischief, and the absence of governmental stability. He assured Egyptian people that the army was capable of operating in the national interest under the rule of the constitution. He urged citizens not to carry out acts of destruction or violence. Should anyone behave in such ways, he warned, they would be dealt with forcefully as traitors. King Farouk fled to Ras El Tin Palace on the waterfront of Alexandria. General Naguib ordered the captain of Farouk's yacht, Al-Marusha, not to sail without orders from the army. The Free Officers debated the deposed king's future. While some believed that exile was the best solution, others argued that Farouk should be put on trial for what they perceived as crimes committed against the Egyptian people. In the meantime, Farouk sought the intervention of the United States, but to no avail. The order for the king to abdicate finally came on Saturday, July the 26th. At 6 o'clock that evening, the king set sail for Monaco, where he lived in exile for the rest of his life. Farouk's baby son, Ahmed Fuad, was proclaimed King Fuad II. But on June the 18th, 1953, the revolutionary government formally abolished the monarchy, ending the child's brief reign. Egypt was declared a republic, with General Mohammed Naguib as the nation's president. Gamal Abdel Nasser was appointed deputy premier and minister of the interior. After 150 years, the Egyptian dynasty had come to an end. The main event of 1952 had overthrown a monarchy and heralded the era of modern Egyptian governance.
Then in 1953, Egypt abolished the monarchy and declared their new leaders Mohammed Naguib, whose mother was Sudanese, and later Gami Abdel Nasser. They both believed that the only way to end British dominance in Sudan was for Egypt to officially abandon its claims of sovereignty. However, Nasser knew that it would be difficult for Egypt to govern an impoverished Sudan after independence. Meanwhile, the British, who hated the idea of Sudanese independence, continued to politically and financially support Abd al-Rahman al-Mahdi, a Mahdi successor, as the British believed he would be able to resist Egyptian pressure for the Sudanese independence. However, when Abd al-Rahman al-Mahdi took political power in Sudan, his regime was plagued by political ineptitude, something that caused him to lose support in northern and central Sudan. Such a loss of power and the lack of finesse or resolve to solve it and meant that Egypt and Britain sensed a great instability forming, and so they let both Sudanese regions vote whether they wished independence or British withdrawal. And the Sudanese people voted.
The world has gained a new nation.
They voted for freedom.
The Sudan, for 58 years under the joint rule of Britain and Egypt, becomes an independent republic.
Voted for power.
In Khartoum, and the new flag is hoisted.
And most importantly, voted for independence. Thus, the period between 1956 and now was declared the independence period. This was a moment where the Sudanese people would enact their will without it being diluted by either the British or Egyptian cocktail or the barrages of other kingdoms and empires who had ruled the country before. Thus, the polling process resulted in the creation of a democratic party along with a new first Prime Minister, Ismail al-Azhari, and the first modern Sudanese government to match. So, to commemorate this new beginning, on the 1st of July 1956, a special ceremony was held at the People's Palace where the Egyptian and British flags were lowered and the new Sudanese flag was raised by the Prime Minister, Ismail al-Azhari. However, soon dissatisfaction at the new government and the new Prime Minister grew, which helped accumulate on the 25th of May 1971 into a coup d'etat. Coup leader Colonel Ghaffar Nimiri became the Prime Minister, and the new regime abolished parliament and outlawed all political parties. Despite from the new Prime Minister's politics or lack thereof, Nimiri was lineaged to the city of Dongola, which was at the time one of the most important places that the Nubian tribes lived. Furthermore, Nimiri entered the Sudanese army and was accused of, in 1955, plotting a coup d'etat against the government. However, further investigation brought no sufficient evidence to indicate Nimiri on anything. In 1971, disputes over Marxist and non-Marxist elements of the ruling military coalition resulted in a briefly successful coup led by the Sudanese Communist Party. However, this was short-lived, as in mere days the anti-communistic elements restored Nimiri to power.
Now, the Sudanese people are sticking together and in power more than any time before. And what is said about this small group of traitors, the gang of the so-called Sudanese Communist Party, is only a minority, and we have already done with about 90% of them.
General Nimiri, can you tell me whether or not Babakar al-Nur has been executed?
السيد الرئيس، هل لك أن تذكر لنا إذا كان حكم الإعدام قد نفذ في السيد بابكر النور أم لا؟
يحدي إلى الساعات الأولى من هذا الصباح كانت محاكمة بابكر النور لم تكتمل.
Then in 1972, the Addis Ababa Agreement led to the ending of the North and South Civil War and a degree of self-rule for the South. Sadly, this 10-year hiatus in the Civil War ended up ending the American investment in the Jonglei Canal project. This was an important irrigation process for the Upper Nile region. In 1970, the Sudanese agriculture output became dedicated to internal consumption, and then in 1972, the Sudanese became more pro-Western and made plans to export food and cash crops. This change in agricultural consumption was perhaps a method to help stimulate the economy with foreign trade and, more importantly, foreign currency. However, sadly, this did not go according to plan as prices declined throughout the 1970s, causing economical problems for Sudan. Meanwhile, debt servicing costs from the money spent from merchandise and agriculture rose. And then in 1976, Ansar's Yahye Mahdi's lot had mounted a bloody but unsuccessful coup attempt. On July 1977, President Namiri met with the Ansar leader Sadiq al-Mahdi, opening the way for a possible reconciliation despite the actions of the Ansar a year prior. The discord between the two men led to hundreds of prisoners of war being released. In August of the same year, an amnesty was announced for all oppositionalists. 1976, the IMF negotiated a structural adjustment program with the government, which helped further promote the merchandising, exports and agriculture. However, this structural adjustment caused hardships to the pastoralists of Sudan and so the Nuba people. This ended the independence phase. The next phase I call the Bashir phase, as he dominated it for the past 30 years. So to finish this timeline, we must jump to his.